Hi folks, this is us learning how to use Zoom. Sorry,
Do you want me to start again, Scott?
maybe do your thing again, yeah.
Hi, everyone. So we're gathering this afternoon, Scott and myself and Cayt Mirra. Cayt Mirra is an experienced English teacher who's agreed to talk to us this afternoon very generously about her experiences teaching English in schools where there's a significant amount of student diversity, particularly culturally and linguistic diverse students. And she's going to share with us this afternoon about her reflections on those experiences and some of the strategies that she's put in place to support those students in her English classroom. So Cayt, can you tell us a bit about your background and experiences and what kinds of schools that you've worked at and the student communities there?
Sure. I started teaching in 2010 in an outer suburban government school. And that was off the back of uni placements in a suburban independent schools. So I feel like I walked into that job probably not very prepared for some of the challenges that I was going to face in those classrooms. That was a school where we had maybe a 10 to 20% EAL population, and almost all of those students came from refugee backgrounds. So we had a lot of early language learners, but we also had some wellbeing issues and some trauma backgrounds that just presented problems that were more serious than the academic ones. We also had, it was quite a low SES school, and there was some pretty high rates of absenteeism, school refusal, and some really disengaged behaviours. And the school that I'm at now is quite different. It's a lot bigger. We're getting fastly and scarily towards 2,000 students. Every 5 minutes, they're putting up new portables. And we are about 50% of our students with migrant backgrounds. Most of the students are fairly proficient English speakers. A lot of these students are students who have spent most of their life in Australia and don't need to be in like EAL streams and will not qualify for EAL English by the time they get to VCE. But where sometimes challenges come in terms of like supporting those students through their schooling is that they have parents who don't speak English. So we're running parent-teacher interviews with 20 interpreters who cover 10 different languages roaming around to help us run those interviews. And if we're making phone calls home for half the students in our school, we're doing that via an interpreting service. So they're just little things that when you first are in that environment, like, oh, that's an extra challenge. But they're kind of important processes to have in place to make sure that we are able to support all of those students and make connections with their families and put in anything that needs to be in place for them. The needs of the students here are a little bit different. There's a lot more academic aspiration. There's quite a lot of academic pressure from families. Most of the students here have families who expect them to follow university pathways when they finish school. So what it kind of comes down to is that success looks really different for different students. So if I have a student in my Year 12 class who very, very desperately wants to get into a specific university course and needs a certain score to do that, then success for me and for that student is for me to get them that score. But I've had at my old school a student who was on the autism spectrum who didn't want to sit in a chair. He'd never sat in a chair in a classroom. And he sat at the back of my room on the floor. And when I tried to talk to him, he pretended I wasn't there. And he continued to pretend that I wasn't there and to pretend everybody wasn't there for most of semester 1. And by the start of semester 2, I got him sitting in a chair. And by the end of the year, I got him presenting an oral presentation with a group of his peers. And that was the biggest win of my year. But that wouldn't look like success for another student, because that would be something that they would just do anyway. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that every student is going to have different needs. And when you work in a school where you have a really diverse, I mean, you have a really diverse group of students in any school, but once we start factoring in socioeconomic status and EAL populations, and specifically refugee populations, there's a lot of wellbeing supports and a lot of literacy supports that really need to be in place.
It strikes me that words like diversity can often be used as kind of masks for actually what's going on. So you're describing a situation where diversity, or the notion of diversity, or diverse groups of students can actually manifest in all sorts of ways in different schools, right? So at one school, you've got a diverse group of students who need something quite different than the diverse group of students you've got in the school you have now. So, the idea that we can sort of prepare or sort of meet diversity in all its varieties easily is really tricky, right? You've got to be attuned to the differences in diverse groups of students, and I think that's really, really important point.
Yeah, and I think that, like, on that, sometimes different types of diversity kind of intersect with each other. So it's all well and good to say, well, this is how you support EL learners, or this is how you support low SES learners, but what happens when you have a student who is from a refugee background and also has ASD, or what happens when you have a low SES student who is also LGBT. So there's so many different things that are going to affect the needs that students have, but when they cross over, they present differently. And so then what that kid is going to need is going to look a little bit different, which I just sort of, I guess, comes down to balancing being aware of best practice around different types of learners, but also that coming second to just getting to know students as individual people. Yeah.
Oh my God, Fleur, I think Cayt might be an intersectional feminist or something.
Outrageous.
Outrageous.
Yeah, we can be prepared for the Australian coming down on us, for being concerned about these things. I'm interested in what this looks like for your planning. Like when you're at your desk, Cayt, and you're planning for your various lessons and catering, what does that look like in practice? What are some of the things you're putting in place to support those students?
That's a really good question, because sometimes when we write our unit plans, we do it the year before we really know who we're teaching, or we're walking into a school and we're being given a lesson sequence that's already been prepared for us. And I think a really important thing, and this can be really hard when you first start teaching, because I know that I wanted to like cling to my lesson plan like it was a life jacket, but you need to be prepared to change the lesson if it's not working or if it's not right for your students. There is just no point, and this is very extreme, but there's no point teaching a student how to write an essay if they don't know the alphabet yet. And on a lesser scale, we kind of need to be prepared to meet students where they are. And if we start teaching them something and we realize that actually there's some building blocks missing, please don't be afraid to just go back in and throw out what you were going to do and do something different. I think as well, and this sort of this is one of those things where you learn by making the mistakes, but sometimes there are things in our curriculum that I'll teach and then I'll say, oh, I didn't really look at that through a lens of that particular experience. So like to give you a few examples, there was actually one of the Year 12 English exams quite a few years ago now, where students are given unseen material, like media persuasive material to analyse. And there was a article that had been written for them to analyse about tourism in an Australian town. And there was a cartoon of the proposed big watermelon that they wanted to build in the town as a tourist attraction. And all of our students from, this was at my old school, our students who were from Myanmar, that was the big group of students that we had in that school, didn't get it. They didn't get it because they didn't know that it was a thing, that we have giant things as tourist attractions in Australian towns. So it was this kind of Australian cultural capital that they lacked, that meant that they were essentially disadvantaged in their exam, because the people who created that exam hadn't thought about it through the lens of like, what cultural knowledge are we assuming that all of the students have. A similar thing that happened in my own class, actually last year, was in that same sort of unit. I was preparing my Year 12s for writing argument analysis, and we were looking at some articles around the date of Australia Day, and they were looking at articles on both sides of that issue. And one of my students said to me, I'm really struggling to analyse what the person's doing objectively. And I was like, yeah, look, sometimes it's hard, but you've got to just don't think about the issue. Don't think about your opinion of the issue. You've just got to put that aside. And she's like, but I'm Indigenous and I can't put it aside. And every time I read these views, my head gets so full of rage that I can't think. And I just thought, wow, I'm really expecting something really unfair of her there, because I haven't thought about the fact that I'm asking her to put aside feelings about something that she has a personal connection to that I don't have. So I can't understand that from her perspective. So I guess that was one thing that, like, where I hadn't considered the different lived experiences of the people in my classroom and what that was doing. In a similar way, students do oral presentations on issues in the media. They get to choose their own thing that they want to talk about. And we had a really interesting situation a couple of years ago where a student wanted to argue about gay marriage and to say that it shouldn't be legal. And his reasons for that were his own, but they were arguments that as a teaching team we felt weren't safe for the other students in the class. We thought about the fact that we have a responsibility to create a safe environment for all of the students. He has the right to voice his views in a task, but we certainly don't have to allow him to subject them to everybody else. So he performed that to a panel of teachers outside of the classroom. So I guess just all of those things, it's about, if you've got a task or a topic that you're looking at, because as English teachers, we are really fortunate that we get to talk about important issues that are happening in the world. But considering that sometimes where an issue for us might be just sort of theoretical or intellectual, that for some students it isn't. For some students it's really personal, and making sure that we're still keeping that classroom safe for everybody, I guess. Yeah.
Can you talk to us about a unit of work that you thought was particularly successful, or some strategies that you feel like have been particularly successful with your students?
Yeah, I think if I looked at things that tend to be successful for students who are either second language learners or have low literacy, there's a few things that sort of cross over for those students and actually just happen to be really good practice for teaching all students. And I mean, that's things like providing sort of chunked steps of how to complete a task. Or it might be things like providing scaffolds like sentence stems or structural templates or worked examples so that students can see examples of what they're trying to do. I think I spent a lot of time in my early years of teaching trying to explain verbally to students what a good essay looked like, when I should have just been showing them examples of them. I don't know why that didn't occur to me earlier, but sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to sort of say what we want when it's better to just show people what we want. I think giving students choice can be really beneficial, because students who have any number of, I guess, risk factors or additional hurdles are probably more likely to be disengaged, and sometimes that we can sort of find ways in. So something that we do at this school, which I mean, you're very unlikely to have the freedom to implement something like this when you walk into a new teaching role, but we run our Year 9 English in electives. So students in semester 2, no matter what class they're in, well, they'll do a text study and they'll do a writing folio, but they pick their genre. So we have a horror class and we have a sci-fi class and a fantasy class. And what that means is that the students are kind of already more engaged, and they're also coming into usually a class where they already have a bit of knowledge. So if I have a horror class and I have some students who are not usually readers and would normally walk into an English classroom feeling like they can't access what we're talking about, we start talking about the conventions of horror as a genre, and they already have a lot of that because they've seen some horror films, because they picked horror, and they're interested, and then they have a way in. I'm currently teaching a unit called the Gamer Life, where we're doing social justice advocacy through video game design. And that's students who have picked that. And it's honestly, it's a class of students who are usually very, very disengaged in English. And a lot of them are very low literacy, but I'm getting some decent work out of them because I can teach them about the role of advocacy, and I can teach them about audience and purpose and persuasive techniques, but they already know all the stuff about games. So they have a way in and they have some knowledge to attach things to. So I think that works well. If you're working with low literacy students, short stories are so good because you can get a far more in-depth analysis. Whereas sometimes I find when I try and do a whole novel with weaker readers, I spend the whole time just trying to get them to read it and understand it. And then we don't get time to actually do anything with it. Whereas a shorter text can allow you to actually teach them how to think about the book, and that's more likely to kind of engage them in that process, I think. And honestly, I mean, I love a writing folio. I always fall back on creative writing because I think we talk a lot about differentiation. I'm sure you talk a lot about differentiation. The thing that I really love about creative writing is that it sort of sorts itself out. Like if you can tell a 5-year-old to write a story, and you can tell a 3rd-year university creative writing student to write a story, and that's going to be a challenging task for both of those writers. So there's a way into it, and there's a way to extend stronger writers through it. And I don't think we do enough creative writing in schools. I also think that we don't do enough low stakes writing. It's always assessed writing. So I think if you've got students who are reluctant writers, and I know at my old school, we had a lot of students where our NAPLAN writing results were really poor compared to our reading results. And it wasn't until we got there's a thing where they send you the actual pieces of writing that each student did, and we looked through it, and half of them didn't write anything. They literally did not write a single thing. So then what that looks like in data is that there's this huge skill deficit where there might not be. It's just that they've just sat there and gone, I don't want to do this. So I think we do too much high stakes writing, and students write something and suddenly it's got red pen all over it, and then they're like, well, I don't want to do that again. So I think that's a really good practice to get into. And I think that we focus too much on the product, and we should be praising the effort, and we should be praising the process, because writing is, I could talk about this for so long, but I guess I see writing as a process rather than as a product. And I think that the way that schools make us assess a big piece of work at the end of the unit has led to this kind of accepted practice where we teach something so that students can produce this one final thing that gets assessed on a rubric, and then that's the end. And I actually don't think that that supports our students who have additional learning needs.
Well, it's a great list. I mean, I think you've nailed a lot of the things that certainly have resonated with my practice in the past. Things like, building on students' knowledge and experience, recognising and building on sort of expertise that students have, and sort of using that as a way to draw them out and to sort of introduce them to new and challenging stuff. Shorter texts, shorter writing, low stakes writing, emphasis on process rather than product, and that idea of finding creative ways into tasks and activities. As a teacher, I know as an English teacher, English teachers are always trying to find those hooks and keys, that can just encourage a student to have a go, to make an effort.
I think that's a really good point, is that we are all trying to do that. And I think sometimes as teachers, we work in silos a little bit because we're all very busy. But that's another really important thing when you've got students with all of these different needs, is that there's supports within the school that you can access that can help you. And that can be, things as simple as the curriculum. But if you have a student who is at a primary school level, like, go back into the primary curriculum standards and look there. Don't just feel like you have to be locked into the task that you're supposed to be teaching them. So most schools are going to have wellbeing support staff, or they're going to have inclusion staff. We have a whole inclusion wellbeing team here. And I have, when I say that I'm getting good work out of my Year 9 gaming students, part of that is that I have 2 other people in the room with me who can help me support all of those students. And sometimes if you are having difficulty connecting with a student or getting to know them or finding a way to get them into something, talk to the other teachers of that student, because someone will have done something that works and not thought to share it. So I spent a class today just sitting in a maths class with the same students that I teach for English, just because I'm working with that teacher on some strategies that we can use. And I wanted to see how those students work in her class under kind of different circumstances. And it's really hard when you first start teaching because you're really busy, but if you can get into other people's classes and see what they're doing, and if you can talk to other teachers about what they're doing, it's so much easier. When there are so many different needs in a classroom, it can feel like it's really impossible. Like, how can we possibly create work that's going to target all of these different points of need? The answer, I think, has to be that you do that in collaboration with other teachers and you share that.
It's a good reminder. Differentiation, or teaching the difference, isn't an individual teacher's responsibility, and in fact, it's not something you can, as you say, can do very effectively on your own. You really need to think sort of more broadly about that.
Yeah, and certainly I've found in my career that working with others and sharing resources and sharing a sense of where that student's at really opens things up for you and gives you different ideas.
Look, I might have made this sound really scary. And I know I said right at the start that I didn't feel prepared when I went into teaching. But like, I'd never do it differently. It was the best. And I'm so glad that I got to work with those students who sometimes were really tough, because I think that made me better because it sort of forced me to cater to those needs. But honestly, like working with students from different backgrounds is just really rewarding if you don't get too caught up in like what are all of the labels that are attached to the different students, and just get to know them, and you will really easily work out how to support them, because you'll just know, like, trust your judgment as a teacher that you know your class and what they need, and resist pressures to follow processes if you don't feel that those processes suit what your students need.
You've had some pretty significant professional relationships as well that have supported, you know, sort of been part of the mix in sort of coming to grips with these issues. So I'm wondering whether or not you could talk a little bit about those, or the role they've played for you. And the other dimension that it was sort of skirted around is your own interest and practice as a writer as well, and how that might have sort of informed your thinking about the sort of issues we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. So that firstly, I mean, I have made friends in the teaching profession who are the closest people to me in the world. And I think that teacher friends sort of end up getting you in a way that non-teacher friends will not, because of the sort of unique challenges of this job. And it's so important to have people in your workplace who you know you can rely on and who can rely on you, because sometimes it's really hard, and sometimes you know, you just need someone, you need to be able to say to someone like, hey, I just don't think this class is going well, can you just come in and have a look? And you need to feel safe doing that. You know, and sometimes you just need to be like, hey, can you just come and watch my class so I can go to the toilet? Like you can't be a teacher without friends to support you. So I think that, yeah, that's been really important. And also what you said about me as a writer, like, yeah, I love writing. I do a lot of writing, and I think it's really central to, I guess, like my identity. And I love sharing that with students. But I had some early disappointment when they weren't into it. Like, do you know what I mean? Like when I was a teenager, I was so into journaling. Like I was the most angsty teen, and I just wanted to like pour it all into a journal. And I was like, oh, I'm going to fix well-being, and I'm going to get all of the girls doing this lovely journaling. And like, they don't want to do that. So sometimes we come in with these passions, and then the students just don't care. And that's okay. You can bring your love of things to the classroom, and even if the students don't love it in the same way, you will still make that a more welcoming and happy place for them because of that, I think. And to kind of tie those two things together, I've done a lot of work with my colleagues around teacher creativity as part of our practice. And I think that as teachers, we have to be creative. And some of the most rewarding, I don't know if you can you call it professional learning, but I'm going to. Professional learning that I've done has been doing like creative writing workshops with teachers, because we don't often get given space to build our own creative practice, because we're always thinking about how to build it in other people. But I think that we can't ask students to engage in practices that we're not willing to engage in. So, you know, if I'm getting my students to do some like independent reading, I'll bring a book and I'll read with them. And if I'm getting them to write a story with a prompt, I'll write one as well, and I'll share it if they're sharing. And I think that you can bring your own interest into the classroom. I think you can usually connect with your colleagues around those shared interests, because, you know, we all got into English teaching because we have an interest in, you know, literature and writing, one would assume. Yeah.
Perhaps one would hope.
Thanks, Cayt.